The idea of today's call is a little bit of a kickoff of 2026. And what I'm going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about goal setting for the year ahead. Going to get a little bit tactical and create some targeted goals. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks that are in the economy at the moment and more widely outside of Ireland and on the global stage and the potential for that to kind of knock us on the head. I'm going to look at the market, and also I'm going to look at these new laws that have been introduced on the market. And then finally, I'll be talking about the just supply and demand and the direction of travel that I would say. We're going to talk about then just some predictions for 2026, 2027 and onwards. So that's the general gist of today's talk. As I say, I'll do some talk, some Q&A at the end. So one of the things that I usually do, I just did this in the last week or so with my own coaching clients, is we always kind of kick off the year with what I call the momentum system. This is something that I find works for myself, and it's something that we cover inside of the program. But really, the idea is you got to kind of create a system like a flywheel to kind of get things going for the year ahead. And obviously, we all have goals and things like that, but goals mean nothing if you don't actually take action on them. And so it's getting clear on what are the actions that we want to be taking. And so I usually break my kind of system up into 6 blocks. And the idea is, in the first one, we're looking for clarity. Okay. Clarity is the big thing. And I'll actually be taking you through some of the clarity stuff now in a minute, but that's one of the things that we like to talk about. We like to talk about the 1,000-day commitment. All right. And this is a concept. I can't remember. I learned it somewhere online and I applied it in my own life and I found it very, very effective. And so that's something that I do strongly. I'll talk about it and you can kind of decide whether it sounds right for you. The 4 pillars we'll talk about. We'll talk about the what I call my M12 framework. Going to talk about the 6-week plan, or 6-week sprint, I should say. And let's get the spelling right. And then finally, monthly reorientation, I should say. And these are just simple things that I kind of take through, but it's a little system that I found anyway, it works for me. And as we're kind of going through it now, you'll kind of see, and maybe you can apply it in your own lives. But where we always begin is, sorry, let me just let some more people in here. Where I always like to begin is I like to kind of start with the clarity, because if you're not absolutely crystal clear the direction that you're going, it's going to be very, very hard to make decisions in the process of doing that. And I don't just mean like, what kind of year I'm going to have and what am I going to do? What am I going to achieve this year? But if it comes into, say, for example, becoming a property investor or anything of that nature, you really need to have clarity on what kind of property investor you're going to be. What type of property are you going after? Where is the value in the market, if there is value? Obviously, at the moment, everyone kind of complains that it looks very, very expensive and toppy. But it's funny, one of the things that I did the last day, I have a thing called the market clock, where I like to ask people whereabouts, if midnight is the time when the market is at its absolute peak, where in the cycle would you say we are right now? And at the time when I asked that, I got there was about 100 people on the call back in November. And of the 100 people, like lots of people just put in, I asked them to give us a number between 1 and 12. And 12 is the peak of the market. 6 is the lowest in the market. Whereabouts on the market clock would you say we are? And a lot of people said 9 and 10. So we're not quite at the peak. There's still room for growth. And that was the view, the general view, which is why a lot of you, I guess, are here on the call as well. You may be wondering, like, what does the future hold for the property market? So what I start with when I'm looking at clarity is today, tomorrow. Okay. So this is what I call the investment career evolution. And a lot of people, when they begin the process of getting involved in investing in real estate or property or whatever it might be, everyone starts down here in this section here, right? This is the small landlord. And what you'll find a lot of the time, and maybe some of you can relate to this, is you never actually went into buying a property with an investor's hat on. You bought the property because you wanted to have a home, and that was your primary motivation at the time. But then either you got married or you moved on or whatever it might be, but you found that you had outlived that property. And rather than sell it, you think to yourself, why don't we actually keep it, rent it out, and get a mortgage and go again and buy the home this time, but have like a rental property? And so what we call that is the accidental landlord. A lot of people start out as an accidental landlord. Other people will be more deliberate and they'll kind of think to themselves, no, I want to be a property investor. I want to build either a portfolio for my own income. And I have a lot of people that are sort of following me on social media. I get DMs and all this kind of stuff. And they will be working as construction people that are in building sites and stuff. And they know that at some point in their life, they're not going to want to do this anymore. Uh, it's hard on the body and things like that. And they're going to want to have some sort of retirement pot. And having a retirement pot is the motivation for getting into property. Instead of, a lot of people would be quite negative on the idea of putting money into the stock market because you see it going up and down all the time and things like that. So these are the different motivations for people getting in. But most people start as a small landlord. That is in, I would say, like 1 to 5 properties. And in the Irish market, the funny thing is small landlord is now actually an official designation. If you have between 1 and 3 properties, you are a small landlord in the eyes of the government. And the rules that apply to your ownership of the property and stuff like that are kind of bound by the number 1 to 3. If you have 1 to 3 properties, then you have a little bit more scope than you would if you were a person with more than 3 properties. The next point that people get into is, and this is a lot of the guys that I'm dealing with inside my coaching and stuff, are the portfolio landlord. You've moved on from 1 to 5 properties and you kind of like the idea. It seems easy enough. You're able to, especially people that are in the kind of the building trade and stuff, they find it easy to improve a property, and so they can add value to it quite easily. And so I see quite a lot of people in construction getting in and doing this, but that's not to say that, you know, a lot of other people do it. We've had all sorts of people through the group, like musicians and entrepreneurs, online entrepreneurs, and even a television presenter, believe it or not. So those are the people that are kind of looking to go from, say, 5 to 20 properties. And usually what people are looking at is they're buying houses. Okay. That typically people are looking at buying residential property and just buying more and more houses. They keep on adding to their portfolio. They keep on renting it out. A lot of people, certainly in my group, are getting into what's known as HMO. And that is where you subdivide a house. And instead of renting it out as a single house, you're renting it out on a room by room basis. So you have a 5 bedroom house. Instead of renting your 5 bedroom house to some family with, you know, four or five people in the family, you actually split that house up, put a lock on each door, and then you rent it out to individuals who just want to rent the room and nothing else. And the reason that people will do that is because you can earn a lot more money doing that. But it's a lot more work as well because you're now dealing with multiple people instead of a single person. That works very well. And some of the guys inside the group have actually been doing that for about 10 years. And they've assembled significant portfolios now. Like one of them would have well in excess of 50 houses. And so that's a pretty decent portfolio. You know, if you consider how, like if you're getting 2 grand a month, that's 24 grand a year. 24 grand a year times 50 properties, you can see the amount of money that has actually been generated by a portfolio of that size. But because of the way he's been buying it and improving it, he's constantly increasing the value of his portfolio. So his equity is constantly growing. And that's one of the things that I kind of teach is how to do that. And in the case of the deal promoter, that is where guys have actually decided, you know what? I want to get bigger than this. I don't want to be constrained by the amount of money that I can personally put into these deals. I want to go out and I want to raise money from others. And that, you know, obviously everyone knows how to go to the bank and apply for a mortgage and things like that. But if you're in a situation where you see an opportunity, and let's say it's, you know, it's a lot more than you can afford, but you have the skills to take on that job, then you're in this position where you say, I really want to do that project. I can see how it would make some good money on it. I can get it at a good price. I know such and such a person who can do the work. How am I going to go about doing that? And that's where you start becoming more of a deal promoter. And that's where you assemble a deal and then you go out and you speak to private investors, and the private investors put the money in that will actually shore up that gap that you can't fill yourself. And that once you get into that stuff, your career can really take off as an investor because you start going out there and being able to raise a lot more money than if you're just doing the portfolio stuff. If you're just talking to your bank, then you're going to be constrained by the fact that banks tend to be quite conservative in their outlook. And the guy that I mentioned that has the 50 properties, like long ago, he stopped dealing with banks. And the way for the average deal that he does, he'll deal with a private investor. He'll get the property under his control. He'll do all of the improvements. And only when the property is producing a nice rental income that he can rely on, then he'll speak to the bank because there's no risk in it any longer. And the banks are quite happy to lend. But that point where you're trying to buy something and do it up and all that, the banks can be kind of difficult in that regard. And so the deal promoter is a nice position to be in. And then you get into real estate developer. That's where you're buying a plot of land. You're going and appointing a team like an architect and engineers and all that. And you're going through the process of applying for planning permission. And then when you get your planning permission, which can take a while, you go and you start building it. And then you appoint an estate agent to sell the houses and so on. And there's obviously quite a lot of moving parts in that. So it is a more advanced area to get into. And then finally, full-time operator. That's somebody that he's gone into turning this into like a full-time professional career, runs the businesses. That's all they do, day in, day out. Up until about this point here, all of this can be kind of done as a side gig that you're actually able to run while you do something else. But once you get up to these two at the end, you start stepping into full-time professional stuff, and you really have to kind of know what you're doing. The reason I'm going through all of this is because I'd love to know if we call this 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Right now, where do you see what would you consider yourself? Put into the chat where are you? Are you a number 1? Are you a number 2? Are you a number 3? I imagine the vast majority are 1, but I'm just curious if anyone here has kind of moved on to the next level. Okay, yeah, that's what I suspected. 4. Well, that's great. I mean, real estate development, that's the gig that a lot of people try to get to, and certainly 0. I like it. Anyway, so the next thing, what I want to do, guys, is this is why I call this the today tomorrow test. In going back to the beginning, I was talking about getting clarity, and some of the clarity is if you were here in number 1, well, then where do you want to get to? Like, if this is where we are today, 2 to 3, that's the kind of, and that's interesting. It's interesting to see 2 to 3, because I see those two as very closely linked, but there's most definitely a kind of a step up in complexity once you go to deal promotion, because now you have to create persuasive documents that will get somebody to agree that, yes, I'm going to put my money into your deal. And you also have to understand how to structure the deal so that A, you minimize the tax, but also you minimize the risk both to yourself and to the other party. If you're in a situation where you're raising money from somebody and the deal goes badly wrong, well, first of all, you're not going to have a very happy investor. But second of all, the deal can go wrong because all sorts of things like construction issues or whatever it might be. You don't want there to be some sort of legal comeback on you or your investor. And so structuring the deal, that's where that all comes in. Up until, as a portfolio investor or landlord, you can kind of look after most of that stuff under your own power. I'm just letting in somebody here. Anyway, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the 1,000-day commitment. The reason I mentioned this is for those of you who are serious about getting from level 1 to level 2, stroke 3, whatever it is all feasible, depending on how much attention and focus you bring to it. And a lot of people, they kind of think to themselves, wouldn't it be great to buy a property? But if I was to tell you that if you were to focus on doing this for 1,000 days, you could probably have 5 or 6 properties in your portfolio within 1,000 days. And that's because things speed up once you gather momentum. The first deal is always kind of the more difficult one because you're at that stage where you maybe lack confidence. There's a thing called paralysis by analysis where we spend forever number crunching and looking at deals and looking at opportunities. And it's because you're at that kind of point where, yes, the deal looks like it could work. It looks like a good deal, but because it's my first deal, I'm just nervous. I'm not ready to kind of pull the trigger. And that holds a lot of people back. But as soon as they've had their first deal and as soon as it works, then suddenly they're mad keen to get to the next one because they realize, God, this wasn't actually as difficult as I thought. And so suddenly momentum builds. And I found that in my own career. I did my first deal when I was, in my early 20s, and it was only like a purchase of a property for myself. But then I bought a piece of land a couple of years later, and that piece of land, in the space of about 6 months, I bought it for 25 grand, and in the space of 6 months, I turned it into 125 grand, like a 5x return on the money that I put into it. And I can remember kind of seeing that and realizing, oh my God, like I have figured out something really, really important here, and something that is life-changing. Because if you're able to make 25, if you're able to turn 25 into 125, then can you turn 100 into 500? Can you turn 500 into 2.5 million? And it starts to kind of grow. And that's the way I suddenly realized. And that was when I got super focused. Up until that point, I was very much kind of looking at a little bit of everything. I was looking at the stock market, and a lot of people are doing this now. They're kind of dabbling in all sorts of stuff. And it's what we call FOMO, all right? Fear of missing out. You see a friend of yours has just made money doing something, and you kind of go, oh, geez, I must try that. And you jump in, and next minute you're doing a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of everything. And the reality is that if you're going to do 10 things, like let's say you've got 10 things that you're kind of trying, the most you're ever going to be able to do is put about 10% of your time into each one. And so you're only ever going to be, at best, mediocre at those 10 things. Whereas if you choose one thing and put 100% of your focus into it, you have the chance to actually do something significant. And that's what I look for. I sort of think, what is the one thing that if I was to put 100% of my attention into it for the next 1,000 days, that would have a really, really dramatic impact on my life? And it could be anything. It could be if I was to just focus all my attention on becoming an investor in property. That's one. But in my case, one of the things that I did is I focused on creating a podcast and creating a following, and started to grow my Instagram and my TikTok and stuff. And that has been a focus for the past, year and a half. And in a year and a half, I've somehow, I don't know why people find it interesting, but there's about 60,000 people following me now just in the last 18 months. And that's the focus on something, that rather than having a focus on 10 different things. And so getting really focused. So one of the things I always say is try to identify, like, what is that one thing that if you were to really focus 100% of your time and focus on it, what would it do? Daily, consistently, something to do on this, whether if it's social media, if it's business, if it's fitness, like all sorts of things, depending on what you value the most. For some people, it's, I want to have, my mother is quite old now. I want to spend time with her and focus on, spending time with her because I don't know how much longer I have. There's no like right answer. It's just, what is it that you think you should focus on for the next 1,000 days that would have the greatest impact on your life? Anyone know who this is? Sort of a silly question, but Usain Bolt is like world famous. But what's interesting is this is just on the whole focus thing that we're talking about. If you look at the race that he's kind of famous for, this is the race that he won in, I think it's in 2016 in Rio. All right. So it was the Rio Olympics. And what's really interesting is everyone knows who Usain Bolt is, like world famous, and primarily because he came first place. Okay. But each of these guys, like this guy here, Justin Gatlin, okay, who came second. How many people know who Justin Gatlin is? Like, unless at the time, very few, unless you follow Olympic sports and things like that. But most people, they would have heard of Usain Bolt. They may not have heard of Justin Gatlin. But Justin Gatlin, look at his time. It's just here, right? The difference is 0.08 of a second. That's the difference between first and second place. And first place gets all the glory. Second place, they barely even remember who won that, And it's not like these other guys are slow. Look at all the times. There's quite a few people that are below 10 seconds for this race, all right? To get but sub 10 seconds in a race like this, you spend years and years and years of your life working on this. And then you're just not remembered. And so that's one of the reasons why, number one, this is why the focus is important. If you are not focusing on something that will massively impact your life, then your life will kind of just drift along, and it's unlikely that you'll achieve anything that you feel is substantial or significant. So that's one of the reasons why I do this. I try to find what is that one thing that would make a major difference to my life. Now, you don't, like, obviously I talk a lot about real estate, investment, housing market, all that kind of stuff, but I don't think that life is so one-dimensional as it's only about business and money and things like that. There are what we call the 4 pillars. And notwithstanding the focus that you have to have on, your 1,000-day commitment, these are the 4 areas that if you don't have some sort of balance in these areas, then your life can go off the charts. And I've seen this myself, business, investing, whatever it is. Obviously, if you don't have financial wherewithal, if you don't have the amount of money that you need to make ends meet, life can be very stressful. There's no question about that. Those of you who know my story, 2008 was a major, major crash, and I ended up minus 16 million. That was the level of debt in the negative that I went into as a result of the big crash. And so I know what it's like to go through extreme difficulty financially and stuff like that. And it's a very, very difficult time when you go through that. So obviously, creating financial abundance and wealth and all that is very, very important. But it's not the only thing. You have to have a look on your health as well. And the reason I know that is my dad died at 45 years of age. I'm now 53, so I'm 8 years older than my dad lives to. And it's at the time when he died, I was in my early 20s, and I can remember thinking, oh, well, Dad's old, like he's 45. And then you fast forward and you kind of realize, actually, no, that was very, very young. And and it was quite difficult sort of watching what happened to him when he got sick and ended up dying. So anyway, that's just your health. That's one of the things that I think you need to kind of keep an eye on. Another thing then, relationships, okay? Those of you who are in a relationship, you will know that if the relationship goes off the rails, it's pretty stressful. And I've been through that. I ended up getting a divorce after the 2008 crash, and I went through that whole acrimony and everything like that. And so I realized that it's kind of it's trying to find some sort of balance between all these things. If you don't have money, it's very stressful. But if your health is in the toilet, it's very, very stressful. If your marriage is going down or your relationship is going down the toilet, it's very, very stressful. And then finally, it's not so much of a stress thing, but a lot of the time people they don't feel like they have a purpose in what it is that they're doing. And this is a source of not so much necessarily stress, but we'll say like a dissatisfaction with the direction that their life is going. Because if you're showing up every day to a job that you hate, then you're not going to be, you might make ends meet financially, but you might just kind of feel like, what's the point of doing this? Like, I hate this. And I can relate because after the big crash of 2008, I had to do whatever it took to try to make ends meet for a couple of years. I remember taking on some really, really kind of shitty jobs that I just thought, when will I get myself out of this hole that I've dug myself? So those are just something, I'm not going to dwell on that here, but it's just one of the frameworks that I use when I'm working on my own goal setting and stuff. What I like to do is, having got the clarity, I like to think about, okay, what is the year? What am I going to achieve this year? What is my number one priority? I'm not talking about the 1,000-day commitment. The 1,000-day commitment, you might sort of say between now and the end of this year, there are certain goals that I would like to achieve. Maybe it's a business goal, maybe it's a fitness goal, maybe it's some sort of a lifestyle goal, whatever it is. But in order to achieve that in this year, it might be a 12-month project. It might be a 6-month project. And so you're going to have to think to yourself, okay, I'm here today, and I want to get to a position where I'm able to say, I've achieved such and such a thing, let's say by October. That is how many months away? And so you're looking at a couple of months, and you say to yourself, okay, that project that I'm looking at, that project, it's going to require me to accomplish certain milestones. And so you break your project down into a framework of milestones. Let's say if you needed to build a house. Well, you start with, where is the property going to be? Where am I going to buy the place? If it's a piece of land, where am I going to find? So you have to identify the piece of land. The next stage then is, I'm going to have to go and I'm going to have to hire an architect or somebody. And then the next stage, okay, I'm going to have to come up with a set of plans and all that. And then the next stage, we're going to have to go for planning permission. So the idea here is just break your project down into micro steps that are actually quite identifiable. And you can sort of say, okay, that's what the focus is for this month. That's what the focus is for the next month. And if you do that, you obviously end up roughly where you want to be in that time frame. Now, one of the ways that we like to do it inside of the accelerator is I look at things in a kind of a 2-month window. And I kind of say to myself that for the next 2 months, that is an 8-week. And I break the micro steps into even more steps. And so I look at, what am I going to achieve in week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And I typically look at this as there's a 6 weeks that I'm going to really work my ass off trying to achieve a certain result. And then when I'm finished, I'm going to take a break. And I'm going to take a week of relaxation and just look back at the plan, look at how I achieved during those 6 weeks. And then the week after that, start making the plan for the next 6-week block. And that's kind of a routine that we have inside, and it works quite effectively. Now, getting into the market itself and everything like that, one of the reasons why I like to just go through that clarity and stuff like that is because you also need to have clarity on the direction of the market. And one of the things to be conscious of is just the fact that the market runs like this. Now, it may not seem like that when you look at it initially. I look at the market and I kind of say, geez, it just seems like prices keep on going up. And so it looks as if it's just a rising market and nothing else. But actually, it's not. If you look at it in detail, it's actually not necessarily the case. So if we go back to, let's say 2006. In 2006, this is when everything was going honky-dory in my business. 2006, okay? People were making millions. Speaking from my experience, I had made a couple of million in 2006, and it was all going really, really well, and it just felt like it was going to keep on going in that direction. In 2009, 2010, you could not give property away. It was such a change from 2008 to 2010 or 2012, that kind of 4-year block. So 2010, absolute total disaster for anybody that was in property. Now, if you had lots and lots of cash sitting in your bank, it was a great time because you could buy things for almost nothing. The next thing to think about is, what are some other years that we can think about? I think most of you will remember 2019. I remember November, December 2019. I was kind of saying, okay, we're starting in a month's time, we'll be into January 2020, and it's going to be the start of a new decade, a new year. And I love all this kind of planning, a new year and and when it's a new decade, it's kind of even more exciting. It's kind of like, what can we achieve in 10 years? What happened in March of 2020? COVID. And so we end up, all of us, in lockdown fairly quickly. And so you can see what I mean just by the fact that whilst the market has continued to go up, there have been these kind of peaks and troughs in terms of investor sentiment. Nobody was buying in April of 2020. And why is that? Well, first of all, you couldn't, because you couldn't go out the door of your house. All of these had major impact on the market. They made people nervous. A lot of people had lost their jobs. All of that kind of stuff was going on. And so you can imagine what it's like for somebody that had just gone out and bought a property in November 2019. And then 3 or 4 months later, they're in the middle of COVID. They might have been freaking out that, oh my God, what have I done? The market is just going to completely collapse. Now, as it turns out, in order to counteract COVID, what the governments in Europe and around the world, they all decided to do was to drop interest rates to almost zero. And so those of you who will remember, around about 2021, interest rates were practically zero. I can remember if you had money in the bank account, you were getting charged by the bank for having money in the bank account. They were actually doing reverse interest or negative interest. So you were being charged for having savings. And that was a crazy time. So what did that do? That obviously meant people were able to invest, borrow money to invest. And what has it done? It's basically when free money is there, the investment market goes crazy. So investment starts to shoot through the roof. And I think most people will remember things like Bitcoin were on fire and all this kind of stuff happened. But what happens then is you get into an inflation spiral. And inflation, when it started to raise its head, suddenly the central banks around the world, they started to increase interest rates. And so in the UK, the EU, America, like the interest rates shot up by at least 5%. I think we're kind of lucky that it didn't go higher than that, because I can remember, speaking of when my father died in 1993, when he was 45 years of age, we came home, excuse me, we came home from the hospital. And my dad, like, you don't know that somebody's going to die until they've died. And you're kind of, we were sitting there and the post was building up and it got to the point where he died. We came home the next day, you're looking at a pile of post and you're kind of thinking, well, he's never going to open that now. And so it's my responsibility to open it and see what's in there. So I started opening it and you start to find bills and stuff. But the worst thing was the mortgage on the house. And so my mom has just become a widow and there was a mortgage on the home. And the only person that was earning in the house was my dad. And so he's now dead. And interest rates were 16%. So compare that to today where you can borrow at 4% or something like that. So you can imagine how unaffordable it would be if we were back in those times. And so we started asking ourselves, what is 2026 going to look like? This is what I meant earlier, by the way, when I said the market clock. So this is a market clock. When you are in the middle of a boom, so let's say this is 2007, when we were at the absolute top of the market. In 2007, Ireland was able to build 85,000 housing units. Today, we can't even crack 35. I mean, we're absolutely miles off of that. Then this was the market crash. Obviously, pretty much everyone went through that unless you're very young. Market crashed. And then probably around about 2012, that was maybe 13. That was the lowest point in the market. If you could raise money in 2013, you could buy stuff so cheaply. It was ridiculous. I remember seeing a property for sale. And if I bought it at the time, it would have been no more than 3 years. The rental income would have fully repaid me for the purchase of that house in just 3 years. So you can imagine you were able to do that at the time. If you had access to money, you could have just cleaned up. And so I'm curious, I'd love if you guys can put into the chat, if this represents, that's 12 o'clock at the top there. This is 6, this is 9, and then this is 10, 11. Where would you say we are in this market? This is where clearly we're in. Do you think we're in a falling market? Do you think we're over here? Or do you think prices are going to continue to rise? Okay, so we have a few people actually think that we've gone over the top. Okay, some people think we're pretty close to the top. Some people think that the consensus seems to be that we're in this kind of area here. So there is still some room for improvement. Some people are thinking that we're here, and some people think that we're actually here. It's going to be interesting to see over the next while. There is certainly, it isn't clear to everybody, but you will find that people have got a belief in where the market is, and that's what indicates to them whether they should be buying, or so they should be selling, or they should be holding. And so this is one of the reasons why I like to ask that question, just to kind of gauge the different opinions around the room. Nobody thinks we're here anyway. Now, sorry. Go into the risks and opportunities, right? This is looking ahead, and when you're thinking about 2026, you're kind of thinking to yourself, would this be a good year to buy? Would this, if I want to go from the small landlord to the portfolio landlord, is this the year to begin that journey, or should I put it off until there's a crash? And then a lot of people have that kind of sentiment, like, I'm going to wait for until there's a big fall, and then I'll start buying again. Thing is that can take years and years. And so you can end up 5 years waiting for that to happen, or even longer. If you consider the last big crash was coming up on 20 years ago now, like 2008 is 18 years ago this year. So how long will it be before there is some sort of an event that causes the market to shift? Interesting and hard to say. I'm going to list out a few of the things that I think, okay? The first thing I would say, the risks, okay? These are the risks that are possibly going to drive down the market. The biggest one, in my opinion, it's only my opinion, but that is the biggest risk to us all, is the headbanger in the White House is just this talk about Greenland, like invading Greenland and taking it by force and all of this kind of stuff. It is just bonkers. The fact that he went into Venezuela last week and deposed the president and brought him back to America to stand trial, like to illegally enter a country so that you can take the guy and bring him back so he can face charges in your legal system, but you broke the international legal system to go and take him out in the first place. Like, it just makes no sense. There's so much uncertainty geopolitically in the world because of the lunatic in the White House. And I think when you think about it from the point of view of, I genuinely think that these are some of the risks that could cause a market collapse. And it won't be, I don't think Ireland is going to collapse itself, because I think Ireland has got the demand, and the demand is so great and the supply is so bad that I think we're going to continue to have a lot of upward pressure. But that said, Donald Trump and all of the kind of the nonsense that he's doing. He's also, I don't know whether you guys have seen, but he's attacking Jerome Powell, who is the Fed chair. Okay. The Fed chair is the guy that sets the interest rates in the American central bank. And he's attacking him because he doesn't like that the interest rates are higher than he wants. And this is, not to get too technical about it, but the whole idea is not to have a very political system when it comes to the economy. If the person in power is coming up for election and he can say, let's juice the economy, let's get everyone feeling like there's loads of money around, that'll be good for me and my election prospects. And so let's juice the economy. What happens then is that you end up with rampant inflation and you end up with the collapse. And so that's one of the things between all of his warmongering that he's talking about. I think China and Russia are watching and sort of thinking to themselves, China is looking at Taiwan, and Russia obviously is in Ukraine, and everyone was kind of giving out that Russia is awful for doing this. And now suddenly Donald Trump is out there kind of making similar noises about Greenland and stuff. And so suddenly you're not in a position where you can kind of say, hey, you should be, following the international legal system. So all of that stuff geopolitically has the potential to create instability in the market. And so one of the reasons why I just mentioned this stuff, you might kind of think that this is all a bit far-fetched and stuff like that, but when you're investing, there are four things that can kind of really damage you. Okay. I call them the four E's. Some of you might have heard me discussing this before. There's your ego and your emotions. All right. The ego and the emotions, they are things that can really drive you to make stupid errors. When in 2006 and seven, I was making loads of money and I decided to kind of go off and spend lots of money on nice lifestyle things. And that's the ego. And you end up going off and borrowing more money that is prudent to do so and stuff. Ego can cause you to do that. Then when the market turned and it started to collapse, I can remember I put a property up for sale and somebody offered me less than I wanted for it. And I got all emotional and I thought, this guy's insulting me. And I refused to sell it to him. Okay. So that's emotions. What happened? Price went on down another million. And I lost. If I had just accepted the emotional upset of being offered less than I wanted, if I had just taken the money, I would have done a million better off than letting my emotions kind of guide me to make worse mistakes. So your ego and your emotions are two major drivers. Then the other things are kind of outside of your control. The economy, okay? You are a passenger in the economy. You have nothing to do with whether it goes up or down. We are just passengers. So this is one of the reasons why all of this stuff is kind of important to keep an eye on, because if something over there happens, it could well impact the economy. And then you always have to think about events, all right? And these are the things that you just simply cannot plan for. So we just mentioned COVID, 2020, April or March of 2020. That was an event nobody saw coming 3 months earlier. Who would have thought that the whole world would have closed down? It's just crazy. 2001, those of you who were around, I remember 2001, September 11th, 2001. It was the third day of my honeymoon, and I was in Barbados, sitting on the beach, when turn on the TV back in the room, and the planes are crashing into the World Trade Center. And I spent the rest of the day watching TV, and I saw the towers collapsing and everything like that. Like at 7 a.m. that morning, there was nobody in the world except for the hijackers that knew anything about what was about to happen. So, but this event had a major, major impact on the global economy. Like the stock market shut down for 5 days in America. All of the airports in America, like it was a no-fly zone across America for a couple of days, like completely unprecedented stuff. So this is one of the reasons why you got to be careful when you're making investments. Don't bet the ranch, to use the American expression. Like, don't go all in on an investment just in case there happens to be some sort of risk of an event, because you never see it coming. And so if you were to say, right, I can't really afford it, but I'm going to go all in on this one investment just because it looks like an amazing opportunity for me to double my money. And if you do that and then there's an event, you could find yourself like out of pocket, penniless. The banks step in and take it on you, and you end up with nothing. So you got to be kind of prudent when it comes to your emotions, your ego, the economy, and then events. Other stuff, let's get closer to home. What are the risks? Okay. Definitely the rent cap rules, that the changes that they're bringing in, and that's for March 2026. Okay, so just a couple of weeks away now. These are having an effect on the market. I know that there have been a lot of people that have already given an eviction notice to their tenants because they want the tenants out so they can put the property on the market before March. Now, personally, I think that was a little bit hasty, and I don't think it was necessary to do that. But this is the kind of effect that rules and regulation changes can have. And so you've got to be careful about this kind of stuff. It has created some uncertainty. I'd love to know, just if you guys want to write in the chat, how many of you think, are uncertain about the rules, the March 2026 rules? Maybe it's less so now, but certainly there was a huge amount of uncertainty when they first announced it. And everyone was kind of like sending me messages. I was getting so many messages in asking, Gavin, does this apply to me? I own this number of properties. Does this apply to me? Because my I'm living in my mother's house, and I'm renting my own house, and all of these kind of scenarios. People were so confused. And so when the people are confused, the confused mind does not buy. And so that's what has happened. And so there's a little bit of a question around March 2026. Will that result in a bit of a buying opportunity for investors out there? It's possible. Certainly, there's a few guys inside of my coaching group that think that this is actually an opportunity, and that if they just are watching the market, if they're looking at, BidX1 and Daft and the various kind of websites that you can find stuff, there's a good chance that you'll find something during that period of time, because people are trying to get out because they've kind of overreacted to the news that this 6-year tenancy. So the rules are stating that from the 1st of March next, any tenant that you sign a lease with will have a 6-year guaranteed tenancy. Okay. And when you see that, you kind of think, whoa, that's very restrictive. Like, what if I wanted to kind of remove that person and sell the property? Well, this is where it comes back to the small landlord at the beginning, and we were talking about. If you have 1 to 3 properties, then there you have certain conditions in which case you can ask your tenant to leave. But if you are 4 plus, you cannot ask your tenant to leave for any reason at all, except if they are in breach of their obligations. So if they stop paying you rent, of course you can. But if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and paying their rent on time, you cannot ask them to leave. And so you might kind of say to yourself, well, if I'm keeping the property long term because I have like a long term view on the market, well, then that's fine. Who cares? But if I'm a person who's not sure what I'm doing, and I want to have the flexibility of being able to sell if I change my mind, that could be a problem, because if you have a property and you're not able to get that person to leave, then you're selling it. The vast majority of people who are buying are people who are buying who have mortgage approval to buy a home for themselves. They are not mortgage approved to invest, to buy a property that has a tenant living in it and to collect rent. That's not what they're there for. So the vast majority of people that you're selling to are people that are looking for a home. And there's a very few people that are actually looking to invest. So your I suppose your pool of potential buyers would be much lower. after that date if you have a tenant in that property. However, there is no, if you have a person living in your property today and they have a lease agreement today, then those same terms apply on the 1st of March. They don't like convert to a new lease. They're still on the same terms that you signed with them this year. So they don't automatically get this 6-year right. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind. For the vast majority of people, if you're looking at buying property, most people are not looking at short-term flip. They're looking at longer term. And so 6 years is not really problematic in my view, unless you're the kind of person who just isn't certain about what you're going, the direction you're going. That's why I mentioned earlier, clarity is so important. If you don't have clarity, it's very hard to make decisions that could impact your portfolio, what you're buying, the types of property you're buying, the types of tenants you want to sign up for, and things like that. Now, some of the other stuff, like those are all the things that are kind of creating uncertainty in the market, which could be seen as a risk that could kind of drive down prices. But then you've also got to look at the stuff that's kind of pushing up prices. So what is pushing up prices? Well, the first thing, demand, all right? We are short property in the Irish market to the tune of about 250,000 units. That's how many units we would need in order to meet the demand that exists at the moment. Now, to build that, at the moment, we're building about 35,000. So you can see how many years it's going to take to meet that demand. If we were to build for the next 10 years, we would still not achieve like the level, because this is not a static number. This is also growing and it continues to go up. And so this number here, 35, we should really be back at the 2007 level. If we were doing 85,000 units a year, then within about 3 years, we might have done some sort of a catch up. And then we might go beyond and we might actually start bringing the market into equilibrium. We're so far away from being able to do that, that demand is going to continue to be like this for a long, long time. The other side of demand is supply, okay? If you are in the Irish market and the maximum you can build is 35,000 units, you kind of say to yourself, well, how could we double that if we wanted to? Anyone who is in the construction sector or anyone who is trying to hire a builder at the moment or an architect or anyone, I would struggle to find any architect or builder or anyone who is not busy, who does not have a full book of clients for the rest of the year already now in January. Like everybody is just so busy. So how are those people going to increase the capacity of their building? They're not. The only way you could really increase capacity is if you were to bring lots and lots of builders from abroad into the country. Now, that is something that in Australia, they were able to do that. They were able to say, come into Australia, you will earn all the money you earn will be completely tax-free for the couple of years that you're living here. You will live in what was almost like a kind of a dorms, and it was kind of like a work camp, but it was a work camp with swimming pools and tennis courts and stuff, and it attracted tens of thousands of workers in, and they built tons and tons of stuff very, very quickly. That doesn't seem like an option here, because where would you put, if you were to say double the size of our construction community and all the laborers and tradespeople and stuff, where would they live? Like, we already have a huge housing crisis. Where would you put them in order to start building more property? One of the things that I'm aware of, and some of you might have heard, Metrolink. Okay. Have you guys been following? Metrolink is this new underground system that they're building in Dublin. This is a huge project. Like, I think it's something like 20 billion in spend. But the thing of what's incredible about it is they're talking about bringing 6,000 workers in to the country in order to build this. 6,000 workers. There's so much, these people, they cannot be found in Ireland. So they're all being brought from abroad. So people in France, the Netherlands, Germany, all those guys, all those professionals that are able to work on this kind of technical project, they're all being employed now. And a lot of them are living abroad, working a couple of days a week at home in their foreign countries, and then they fly into Dublin in order to attend site meetings and various things like that. And then they have to go back because there's nowhere for them to stay longer term. So at the moment, Metrolink is booking up hotels like in huge numbers just to kind of accommodate all these. But that's just one project. Like we need to do thousands of these. So you can see what I mean. The market is just unable to deliver the amount of property that needs to be built in order to meet the demand. And the demand continues to go up because we have continued migration into the country. Whether with migration comes in all sorts of forms. There's lots of people that are coming in that are needed, professional people that work in these kind of jobs that are required. But there's also, there's the asylum seekers and there's those kind of guys that are creating a bit of friction in the country as well. And all of this stuff is just pushing up demand for housing. And I think I've seen estimates that they reckon that the Irish population over the next 30 years is going to grow by another million people in the next 30 years. And that is a huge amount of growth. Because if you consider we're already at maximum capacity for the housing sector now, another million homes, what's that going to look like over the period? So, in my view, this all points to quite a lot of opportunity as a investor. But the big problem that you have is that when you're an investor, if you're buying a house, the difficulty you're going to have is that you are bidding against a family. You are an investor, you're looking for a good return on your investment. You're looking for the money that you put in to, pay you back quickly. But if you're bidding against on a house and the obvious other, purchasers are people who are mortgage approved and they want to live in that house, they are going to get emotional. And when you're emotional, your decision making is usually flawed and you will usually bid more than you are, than it makes sense to. And so if you are a rational, calculating investor and you're looking at buying a property, you'd be thinking, okay, if I can get it for 270 grand, then I can, make a good return on my money. And then a family comes along and say, well, we're approved for 300 grand. So let's bid everything we can to get this property and let's just stop this constant search for homes and the stress of it and all that kind of stuff. So there's the family stress and the family emotion. Let's get a home, let's get a permanent place to live. And then there's you on the other side trying to make like a return on your investment. It's very, very hard to make money when you're bidding against people that are looking for a home. One of the things that we've been doing inside the group, and this is one of the reasons why it's important to move to that level where you're a deal promoter and you're able to go out and raise money, is because if you can, instead of going after a house, if you're going after, say, a larger property that maybe could accommodate 10 or 15 people, you might sort of say, well, what kind of property does that look like? We just recently, inside of my group, we had a guy that was looking at a former health service executive building. I think it was in Carlow, and it was a building that the HSE had just moved out of, and they put it up for sale. And I think it went for 400 grand, but it had 13 rooms. And it was located right next to Carlow University. And so it's a very obvious student accommodation play. And in the end, he let it go. Somebody bid 416. I think he bid 416 and somebody else went to 430 and it was secured at 430. But that deal made sense all day long, right up to possibly up to 450. You were still making really, really good money on that. And you're not bidding against lots and lots of people because it's not a home purchaser bidding against you. It's another investor who maybe is more aggressive in their calculations or is a person that says, you know what, I'm a builder. I have a building team. I can send a load of lads in there and they'll have that thing, refurbished in no time. Whereas if you're an investor who has to hire a builder, then there's going to be a builder's margin on that, and it just means that you can't bid the same level as that person. But at least you're not bidding against somebody who's emotionally attached to the idea of living in that location. You're bidding against another investor. And this is one of the reasons why learning how to raise money and being able to kind of go after those larger deals that are not at the kind of individual buyer level, but are kind of more professional. Those are the guys that you're going after. The stuff that I cover inside of my own coaching program is I call it the ORC framework. It's opportunity. You've got to be able to assess an opportunity and make sure it makes sense. You've got to be looking at risk as one of the biggest drivers of mistakes and loss of money and all that kind of stuff. And if you're raising money from investors, this is a major thing. You have got to be able to discuss the risks, because a lot of the time the person who has the money, maybe they don't have the time anymore to get involved in rolling up their sleeves, but you can be sure they understand how they could lose their money. So they're looking at the risks. You have to be able to speak to them. You have to be able to sort of explain why this property deal makes sense, how you've de-risked it. And that's what we cover. This is capital, okay? Raising money. How do you go about raising money? Whether it's lenders, whether it's private investors, whether it's you're going into the niche lenders that are out there. There's various kind of hybrid lenders that are doing different things. And and then the final one is basically enhancement, okay? When you look at a property, if you buy something for 200, what you want to do is you want to spend maybe 50 grand doing it up. So your total spend is maybe 250, but that money was spent in a way that has added 100 grand of value to it. So you spent 250, but you're actually now worth 350. So you create this profit or this equity in the deal. And then you can go back to the bank and you can release some of that back to you, so you can kind of recycle it and go again. That's what a lot of people do. It's known as the B or method. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. Buy, refurb, rent, refinance, and then just go again. All this kind of stuff, anyway, we cover inside of the group. I'm looking at the time. I'm conscious that that I've used up a lot of my time. One of the things just to bear in mind when it comes to risk is not eliminated by knowledge. What we teach is all the different risks that are out there, and then it's just a matter of judgment and how you can manage that risk. Can you manage it? Is it a risk that's worth taking? At the end of the day, risk is everywhere, but it's risk versus reward. Is the reward worth the few risks? Like, there's always going to be risk. If there wasn't, everyone would just be out there, mortgaging themselves up to maximum. Because there's risk, that's what holds people back from making the decisions. And so part of the whole thing is just understanding how it works means that you have a little bit more confidence. Predictions for the next 10 years, like the further out we get, the more difficult it is to predict, because it could be an amazing market or it could be a complete disaster. So it's always good to be looking at something that's not too far away in terms of turning it around and getting your return back on your investment. If you're looking at buying something and refurbishing it like 12 months, that's a pretty good, you can see 12 months ahead with reasonable amount of, the ability to predict. But if you're getting into land development where you're buying sites and things like that, if you're buying something without planning permission and you have to go through that process, you could be looking at 3 years. And that's where it becomes difficult, because who's to say, is Greenland under a US flag a year from now, 2 years from now? The further out we get, how would the rest of the world react to that? Would China, take Taiwan or all these? The further out you get, the more difficult it becomes to just decide. And that's one of the reasons why you're kind of better off trying to kind of compact the timeline between buying, turning it around, getting value, and then getting yourself kind of out of difficulty. What you want to do is you want to stabilize the income from the property so that at the very least, you're able to keep the banks at bay. Like they've got an interest bill that comes out every month, you're able to pay it. Even if the market falls and the property has gone down in value, if you can pay the bank, then they keep away from you. But if you stop paying them, that's when you become this kind of delinquent creditor and they start kind of going after you for that reason. So guys, if you're interested, if like, I hope this was useful. I'll do a bit of a Q&A now, but if anyone is interested, there's a website that I created just to kind of understand the different way the programs work that I have. Maybe you want to screenshot that or whatever, but that there just I just kind of just explain how the different programs work and the different ways in which you can kind of go about working with me if you want to. And if not, well, I'll be here again next month, and we'll cover some other topic related to this process. And so let me stop sharing now, and I will throw open if anyone wants to ask any questions. I have to go in about 10 minutes. So in HMO, let's see. So James is asking a question. In HMO, what practically moves an arrangement from a tenancy to a license beyond contract wording? What actually needs to happen in practice, especially around exclusive possession of bedrooms for the RTB or court to accept it as a license? Well, this is an area that it's a little bit gray. You got to be kind of careful with this because it's not always clear exactly how. First of all, the RTB shouldn't be involved in this at all. The way the guys that we have inside of our group, you've got a license or you've got a lease. When you've got a license, it means that it is not a permanent arrangement. That person is, it's like a bed and breakfast. If somebody comes up to your house and says, "Can I stay the night in your house?" You say, "Yeah, no problem. Here's the bedroom." But you're not kind of like saying, "Here's the keys and you can live here now for as long as you want." It's kind of like the arrangement is that you're going to be moving out. In a HMO, the way it's done is that you are being told that you will be given a room, not this specific room. And that's how the wording kind of works. Is you like what happens? Certainly, there's a few people that are doing it quite a lot inside of our group. And what they do is they basically, whenever a room comes empty, they'll actually sort of go to somebody and say, "Hey, we'd like to actually move you down into this other room." And that way, the person who's been there the longest is not kind of like feeling like that they have that room. It's that theirs. You don't want them to feel like they have permanent rights to the room, because as soon as it's a lease, then they can turn the lock and they can't let you in. Whereas when it's a license, you have the right to kind of go in, and usually there's cleaners and there's all that kind of stuff. And so there is a few people that actually give advice on this kind of stuff. There's a lady called Mary Conway, and Mary's in my group, and she does a lot of this kind of stuff. She's the head of the Irish Property Owners Association, and so she's very good for that kind of thing. One of the things I will say about HMO is the market is getting a little bit saturated with HMOs now. We have noticed one or two of the guys that are really busy doing HMOs for the last couple of years. They've moved away from it, and they're now getting into buying sites and building houses because they just can't find value anymore. And there's just so many different people kind of going after a property for a HMO that they're just struggling to find value. And in the past, it made real sense to do it. I'm not sure if that's answered your question, but definitely you need to make it so that it's clear that this is a temporary room. It's not a guaranteed kind of like room for life. What will happen with the new March rules when it comes to HMO? Well, the difference that I'm talking about in a HMO, right? If you're doing it correctly, then it is a license, not a lease. So if it's a license, then these March rules don't come into it. You're not actually signing a lease with somebody on the 1st of March. They're just entering into a license agreement to use a room, and it's not a kind of a long-term thing. It's like a month to month. So after a month, in practice, people just stay there as long as they want, but it's a month to month kind of a thing. And so after a month, you could ask them to leave, but in practice, you don't. One of the reasons why people will do this is because you don't establish it's landlord and tenant law is covered by leases, but it is actually trading. It's a trading agreement when it comes to license. And what we've seen is it actually affects also the taxation. So if you own a property and you're renting it, and the rental income, if it's inside of a company, we'll say the rental income is 25% tax on it. But anything that is any retained earnings, they attract a surcharge of 12.5. So you end up paying about 37.5% tax on any retained earnings in the company. But if you do it as a license and it's a trading business like an Airbnb or something like that, then it's only 12.5% tax because it's a trading business. And so that makes a big difference. The problem is you also have to then register for VAT when you achieve the VAT threshold. And so that also makes it kind of difficult. So we have an accountant inside our group that kind of advises on that. I don't like to give advice when it comes to accounting because it changes all the time. So somebody's watching the video today, oh, Gavin said this, and then the law changes in a month's time, and you're still basing it on something you heard me say a month ago. Do you cover commercial property investment? Yes, that's one of the things that I spend most of my time talking about, because I think commercial is really the gig that you should be into when you're getting into deal promoting, because commercial property, like I've bought properties, commercial properties, and I doubled and trebled my money on it. If you buy a residential property, you will almost never double or treble your money. Like if you were to buy a property tomorrow and fill it with gold taps, and turn it into a Donald Trump looking kind of palace type thing, the property value has not doubled and doesn't go up like double or treble in value. But with commercial property, the way it works is the value is based on the income that's being generated and a yield. And so if you buy something and you're collecting, say, 100 grand a year in rent from it, if you manage to get the tenant to increase the rent to 200, you will have doubled the value of your property, essentially. And so we find it much, much more like I only really invest in commercial property myself. I stopped doing residential stuff years ago because it's so much hassle. Now, one of the good things, if you're going to look at the market, the way the market, there are three areas of the market that are working at the moment, and we call it beds, sheds, and meds. All right. And what it is beds, so living accommodation, that is in demand, huge demand. So big investors are buying up blocks of apartments because that's where all the money is. Sheds, warehouses, those kind of things like logistics centers, warehouses, factory buildings, all of that. Those sheds that you see, in industrial estates and stuff, those have shot up in value in the last couple of years. Like COVID actually, whereas the office market went into the toilet during COVID, the logistics market, factory buildings and all that, they all shot up because everybody needed to have distribution warehouses. Amazon did far more business during COVID than they did before COVID. And so warehouses became very, very valuable. And you suddenly have people that need to have a distribution hub in Dublin and then smaller hubs based around the country. And then you'll also see, if you think about it like this, anybody can work from their kitchen table at home. But if you are manufacturing something, let's say you manufacture refrigerators, you can't do that at home. You have to have a factory building to do that. And if you build it, where do you send it? You don't send it direct to a person's house. You send it to a distribution warehouse. And then the truck backs into the distribution warehouse and it loads up and then it brings it to the shops that are selling it. And they usually have some sort of a warehouse as well. So warehouses, factory buildings, they're hugely valuable. And then meds is the kind of the health sector. Health, medical buildings, things like that. They're all going through enormous growth at the moment. So there's a thing called health life sciences. health technology, longevity and drugs and medicines and all that. That's all going through an enormous amount of growth as an industry. And those guys, they don't occupy a normal office. They need offices that have labs. And so labs have got higher floor to ceiling heights and all this. So these guys are quite specific in terms of what they need. So meds, or the medical sector for offices and stuff, we've just done a deal with somebody on that, and it's a very valuable deal because it's the medical use. As a beginner in the Irish market, what would you recommend starting with? You mentioned HMO is beginning to become saturated. Is it too advanced? It's not that it's advanced, it's just that when you get into like managing a HMO, you've got to have time and you got to kind of know what you're doing. It's something that requires a bit of nuance. I like when I know somebody that is doing this kind of stuff day in, day out, and he builds these properties, he converts them, he turns them into a HMO, but he doesn't do any of the management. He doesn't want to have any of the day-to-day dealings with people. He hires somebody in to go and do that because it can be so much work. There can be interpersonal, conflict between people. If you buy a house, let's say you buy a 5-bedroom house and you convert the living room into a bedroom, that makes it a 6-bedroom house. Maybe you extend out the rear and make it a 7-bedroom house. And we do have people inside the group that have done that kind of thing. And some of them gone as 8 and 9 beds. That's all great, but if you don't upgrade your kitchen, you're going to end up 8 or 9 people trying to share a kitchen that was designed for a family of 4 or 5. And so you end up with all sorts of conflict. And you end up with people squabbling and like, I don't want to live with this asshole. He's always like hogging the cooker or whatever. So what our guys, Mark, good to see you. What our guys that are doing this on a professional level will do is they will put in 2 cookers, 2 fridges, 2 washing machines, so that there's plenty of capacity there for the people that are living in it. And I think that's kind of approaching it in a sensible way. That particular person as well, I've been working with him for a couple of years as a client, and I remember him sort of saying, "What is the biggest risk to me?" And I said, "Look, I think probably you're going to be fine for a couple of years, but the risk that is kind of hovering above you is that what if the Irish government decide at some stage that they want to regulate this and they want to make HMOs a regulated market?" In the UK, HMOs are regulated. So you go to the UK, you cannot you cannot buy a house and turn it into a HMO. You need to get a license. It has to get planning permission, all sorts of rules and regulations. If it is going to be HMO, there's rules on the size of the rooms and all that. If the UK is anything to go by, there's a chance that the Irish market will eventually adopt the same kind of rule and approach. And they might turn around and say, right, HMOs, they've been kind of a gray area up until now, but actually going forward, we're going to actually regulate it. And so as a regulated entity, you're going to have to now do all these things. And so that could suddenly mean that, oh shit, now I can't actually do this anymore. I'm going to have to, change what I'm doing and whatever. And in the case, what we did in order to de-risk his portfolio is he went and he got the UK regulations, and everything, all of the designs that he does, whenever he's refurbishing a house, he makes sure that it all complies with the UK regs. So if the Irish market was to adopt regulation, it's most likely it'll adopt the UK regs. And then over a couple of years, they'll probably tweak it and change it. But the initial one will most likely look just like the UK.